The biting wind whips Alara's worn dress around her swollen belly, a stark banner of her vulnerability against the vast, indifferent plains. Dust stings her eyes, but she doesn't flinch, her gaze fixed on the trio of riders who've darkened her doorstep. Their leader, a man with eyes like chips of flint named Redwin, smirks, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He wants supplies, her meager store of flour, the last slab of bacon, the little she has hoarded for the coming winter and the child within her. She stands alone, a solitary figure of defiance before her isolated, sod-roofed cabin, the only home she has left. Her husband, Tom, lies buried on the rise yonder, victim of a fever that swept through too quick. Now these men, smelling weakness like wolves on a dying calf, have come to pick the bones clean. Just a bit of neighborly sharing, ma'am, Redwin drawls, his voice slick with false courtesy. Wouldn't want you to be overburdened, what with your condition. His eyes linger on her stomach, and a cold dread coils within Alara, tighter than the baby's kick. She knows this isn't sharing. It's theft, and it will mean starvation. She lifts her chin. I've nothing to spare for men who prey on the weak. Her voice is steadier than she feels. A small, courageous spark in the face of looming darkness. The wind seems to pause, holding its breath. Redwin's smirk fades. One of his men, a younger, jumpier sort, shifts in his saddle. This is it, the moment the bluff is called. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The air crackles with unspoken threat. Redwin's hand tightens on his gun. Alara can almost feel the cold metal against her own skin, the finality of it. She thinks of the child, the tiny life dependent on her, and a fresh wave of desperate courage floods through her. She will not break. Not yet. Her eyes, though, betray the fear she fights to conceal, the stark understanding of her isolation in this unforgiving land. The silence stretches, taut and terrible. Then, a voice, calm and deep, cuts through the tension from the cover of the cottonwoods lining the dry creek bed nearby. I believe the lady said she has nothing to spare. All heads snap towards the sound. A figure emerges, tall and lean, moving with a quiet grace that speaks of familiarity with shadows. He's dressed in dark, trail-worn clothes, but it's the mask that commands attention. A simple black cloth covering the lower half of his face, leaving only his eyes visible. They are startlingly pale, narrowed against the sun, and hold a gaze that seems to pierce right through Redwin and his men. He holds a rifle not aimed, but held with an easy readiness that is more menacing than any overt threat. Redwin's eyes narrow. And who might you be, friend? Her new man. The masked stranger doesn't answer the jibe. He takes another slow step forward, the rifle still balanced loosely. Let's just say I'm a man who dislikes seeing odds of 3 to 1, especially when the one is a pregnant woman. His voice, though muffled by the cloth, carries an undeniable authority. I suggest you gentlemen find your charity elsewhere. This well looks dry. Redwin scoffs, but there's a new uncertainty in his posture. His men glance at each other, then back at their leader. The stranger's sudden appearance, his unnerving stillness, the mystery of the mask. It's an unexpected complication. Alara watches, heart hammering against her ribs, a fragile hope unfurling within her. This masked man, appearing as if from the very dust and wind, is an unknown quantity. But in this moment, he is the only shield she has. The outlaws, faced with an armed, resolute figure whose capabilities are unknown, hesitate. The balance of power so heavily skewed moments ago has shifted. And with 3 words, the masked cowboy had not just spoken to the outlaws, but seemed to make a silent vow to the terrified woman before them. His quiet "I'm here now," hanging in the air like a shield. His life and hers were irrevocably changed. The wind continued its mournful song across the prairie as Redwin and his men, after a tense, silent standoff, finally wheeled their horses around and rode off, their backs stiff with unspoken resentment. They didn't look back, but the threat of their return lingered in the air, as tangible as the dust they kicked up. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her knees suddenly weak. She leaned against the rough-hewn doorframe of her cabin, one hand protectively covering her belly. The masked stranger remained where he was for a long moment, watching the outlaws disappear over the horizon. Only then did he lower his rifle slightly and turn his unsettling pale eyes towards her. Alara found herself studying him, this unexpected guardian. He was tall, as she'd noted, with broad shoulders that spoke of strength, even beneath the loose fit of his duster. The mask, a simple bandana, likely black or dark blue, was tied neatly, obscuring his nose, mouth, and jaw. It lent him an air of dangerous anonymity, yet his eyes, when they met hers, held a disconcerting steadiness, not unkindness. He walked towards her slowly, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic clinking that was a stark contrast to the earlier jangle of the outlaw's gear. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Are you all right, ma'am?" His voice was still muffled, but the concern in it seemed genuine. Alara nodded, finding her own voice, though it was raspy. I think so. Thanks to you. They would have taken everything," she swallowed, the knot of fear still lodged in her throat. "Who are you?" He hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her small, vulnerable homestead, the patched roof of the soddy, the struggling vegetable patch, the vast emptiness surrounding it. "Just a traveler," he said finally, his eyes returning to hers. "Happened to be passing through. Call me Silas." "That'll do, Silas." The name meant nothing to her, but his presence meant everything. He had appeared from nowhere, a guardian angel clad in dusty denim and a concealing mask. Her husband, Tom, had been a good man, strong and hard-working, but he'd been an open book. This Silas was a mystery, his past and his reasons as hidden as his face. She knew the stories of masked men. Some were outlaws themselves, hiding from the law. Others were vigilantes, dispensing rough justice where the law was too slow or too weak. Which was he? "They'll be back," Alara stated, the words flat with a grim certainty that settled heavily in the pit of her stomach. Redwin isn't the type to be easily deterred. He'll see this as an insult. She knew the ruthlessness of men like him. This land bred them or drew them in. The nearest town, Redemption, was a good day's hard ride, and its sheriff was an old man with too much territory to cover and too few deputies. Lawlessness often reigned supreme in these isolated pockets of the frontier. Silas nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Likely. Men like that have long memories for perceived slights." He looked around again, his assessment of her meager defenses no doubt swift and accurate. A sod cabin was sturdy against the weather, but not against determined men with guns. "This is a lonely place for a woman in your condition, ma'am." "Alara," she supplied. "My name is Alara, and yes, it is. But it's all I have." Tom had poured his heart and soul into this small patch of land, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. She wouldn't abandon it, not while his memory was still fresh in the earth he'd tilled. And there was the baby, her anchor and her future. The wind rustled the dry grass, a sound like a whispered warning. Silas seemed to listen to it, his head tilted slightly. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken questions. Alara felt a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He had saved her, for now. But what did he want? Why had he intervened? Men in this territory rarely did anything for nothing. "You can't stay here alone, Alara, not if Redwin's got his sights set on you," Silas said, his voice firm. "They won't just be after supplies next time. They'll be after satisfaction." A shiver ran down her spine despite the afternoon sun. She knew he was right. The Red Wind gang was notorious in the territory, whispered about in hushed, fearful tones in Redemption's general store. They were known for their brutality, for taking what they wanted and leaving ruin in their wake. Stories of burned-out homesteads and worse followed them like a trail of carrion birds. She'd heard a passing trapper mention, just last spring, how the Redwinds had terrorized a small settlement further west, leaving it practically a ghost town. That fleeting micro-cameo of their reputation had been enough to solidify her dread today. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The truth of it was a lead weight in her chest. Her family was back east, too far to reach, too estranged by her decision to follow Tom West. Silas was silent for a long moment, his masked face unreadable. He looked at her, then at the cabin, then out at the endless expanse of prairie that offered both freedom and profound isolation. The setting sun was beginning to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, beautiful but also signaling the approach of another night, another period of vulnerability. The cabin, her small fortress, suddenly felt very fragile. "Then I reckon I'm not just passing through anymore," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. He shifted his rifle, resting its stock on the ground. "If you'll have me, Alara, I'll stay. I'll stand by you. We'll see what Red Wind and his boys do when the odds ain't so skewed in their favor." Alara stared at him, stunned. He was offering to stay, to put himself between her and a dangerous gang of outlaws, all for a stranger. It was an act of reckless generosity, or perhaps something else she couldn't yet fathom. The initial awkwardness of his presence, the fear of the unknown that his mask inspired, began to war with a desperate, burgeoning hope. His quiet attempts at providing safety, this monumental offer, hinted at a depth she hadn't anticipated. The emotional journey ahead felt vast and uncertain, much like the landscape that surrounded them. The immediate aftermath of Silas's declaration hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Alara, still leaning against the doorframe, felt a tremor of exhaustion pass through her. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Red Wind was ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the dull ache of her advanced pregnancy. "Stay?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "But why? You don't know me." Silas's gaze, those unsettlingly pale eyes above the mask, met hers. "I know courage when I see it, ma'am, and I know bullies. Red Wind needs to learn this place ain't his private pantry." He paused, then added, his voice a fraction softer. "Besides, it's not fitting for a woman, for you, to face them alone again." His intervention hadn't been a passing whim, then. It was rooted in something deeper, a principle, perhaps, or a past experience that made him react to her plight. Alara considered his offer. The thought of facing another night alone, listening for every creak and rustle, imagining Redwind's leering face in the shadows, was terrifying. But inviting a masked stranger, a man with no discernible past, into her home, into her life, was a gamble of a different kind. Yet what choice did she truly have? Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her life and the life of her unborn child were at stake. She pushed herself upright, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her lower back. I would be grateful for the company, Silas. And the help. Her cautious acceptance was a leap of faith, a fragile tendril of trust extended into the unknown. Silas nodded once, a gesture of quiet affirmation. "Then we best make some preparations. They won't wait long." His quiet resolve was a balm to her frayed nerves. He seemed to take charge effortlessly, not in an overbearing way, but with a practical, focused energy. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, eerie shadows. The first test of their fledgling alliance came with the encroaching darkness. "The cabin, it's small," Alara said, a flush rising to her cheeks. "There's only one bed. My husband, he built a lean-to for storage. It's rough, but it offers some shelter." "The lean-to will do fine for me," Silas said without hesitation, dismissing her unspoken concern. "First, let's secure the cabin as best we can. Doors, windows, anything they might try." They worked together as dusk bled into night. Silas, it turned out, was remarkably resourceful. He inspected the single wooden door, noting the worn leather hinges and the simple latch. He found Tom's old tool chest and, with a few well-placed nails and a piece of scrap timber, reinforced the doorframe and fashioned a sturdier bar for the inside. Alara, despite her clumsiness and the constant discomfort of her pregnancy, helped where she could, handing him tools, holding the lantern, her initial apprehension slowly giving way to a grudging respect for his competence. He examined the two small windows, their panes made of greased paper that offered little resistance. "These are weak points," he said, his voice thoughtful. He found some old shutters Tom had started making but never finished. With some effort, they managed to affix them, providing at least some barrier. Their shared task, born of necessity, created a small, temporary bridge over the chasm of their unfamiliarity. There was little conversation, mostly Silas's terse instructions and Alara's quiet acknowledgments, but the silence was companionable, a shared purpose filling the small space. Later, as a sliver of moon rose in the inky sky, Alara prepared a meager meal, a thin stew of dried beans and a few wild onions she'd gathered. She felt a pang of guilt offering him so little after he had potentially saved her life. "It's not much," she said, her voice laced with apology as she ladled a portion into a tin bowl for him. Silas accepted it without comment, sitting on an upturned crate near the doorway of the lean-to, his rifle propped beside him. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping the darkened perimeter. Alara watched him from the cabin doorway, the flickering lamplight inside casting her own long, distorted shadow. The mask remained in place, a constant reminder of the mystery he represented. Who was this man who had appointed himself her protector? What ghosts haunted him that made him seek out danger, or perhaps, run from something else? A coyote yipped in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that amplified the silence. Alara shivered, drawing her shawl tighter. Do you think they'll come tonight?" Silas finished his stew and set the bowl aside. "Hard to say. Redwin might want to let you stew in your fear for a bit. Or he might be arrogant enough to think we're unprepared for a swift return. We stay alert." His voice was calm, reassuring, but his eyes, glinting in the faint moonlight, were watchful, missing nothing. He suggested a watch schedule. He would take the first half of the night, Alara the second, if she felt up to it. She agreed, though the thought of sleeping while a masked stranger stood guard was unsettling. Yet, paradoxically, the thought of trying to sleep without his presence was now even more terrifying. The hours crawled by. Alara lay on her narrow bed, her body aching, her mind racing. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats, every rustle of leaves like a footstep. She thought of Tom, his solid, comforting presence, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her. She was so alone, despite the stranger outside her door. Or was she? Silas was out there, a silent sentinel. His reasons might be his own, but his protection felt real. Sometime after midnight, a new sound cut through the night, a low, persistent scratching at the back wall of the cabin, near the small, shuttered window. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She sat bolt upright, straining her ears. Came again, more insistent this time. She crept to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the newly installed bar. "Silas?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Instantly, his dark shape materialized from the deeper shadows of the lean-to. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and urgent, his rifle already in his hands. "The back wall," she breathed. "Scratching." He moved with silent speed, circling the cabin. Alara waited, her breath caught in her chest, imagining Redwind's men prying at the sod bricks, trying to find a way in. The silence stretched, amplified by her fear. Then Silas returned, his posture slightly less tense. "Coyotes," he said. His voice still low but laced with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher: relief, perhaps, or even faint amusement. Or maybe a badger, trying to dig under the wall for warmth or scraps. Nothing to worry about from men, this time. Relief washed over Alara, so potent it left her weak. Coyotes, not outlaws. She leaned against the door, feeling foolish. But the fear had been so real. Silas watched her, his head tilted. "It's all right to be scared, Alara. Only fools ain't scared in situations like this." His unexpected understanding, the gruff kindness in his tone, chipped away another small piece of her reserve. He wasn't just a stoic protector. There was a current of empathy beneath the masked exterior. Perhaps this fragile alliance, born of desperation and unexpected intervention, could become something more. Perhaps, together, they could weather the storm that Redwind's inevitable return would bring. The night was far from over, and the true test of their partnership was yet to come. But for now, a small measure of solace had been found in the shared vigilance against the vast, dark prairie. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm of waiting and preparation. Silas proved to be an invaluable presence, his quiet competence a steadying force against Alara's mounting anxiety. He was an early riser, and Alara would often wake to find him already scouting the perimeter of their small homestead. His tall figure a dark silhouette against the pale dawn sky. He moved with a hunter's grace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, missing no detail: a disturbed patch of earth, a distant dust devil, the flight patterns of birds. He taught her to look for signs, to read the land in ways Tom, a farmer at heart, never had. "See those buzzards circling to the east?" he'd said one morning, his voice a low rumble from behind the mask. "Too far to be interested in us, but it means something died out there." Or someone, his words were stark, a reminder of the harsh realities of their existence. Alara, in turn, tried to make their forced cohabitation as bearable as possible. She cooked what little food they had, stretching it with wild greens and roots Silas sometimes brought back from his scouting trips. She mended his torn duster with clumsy stitches, her fingers fumbling with the needle and thread. During these shared domestic moments, a fragile understanding began to grow between them, unspoken yet palpable. He never spoke of his past, never offered any explanation for the mask that was a permanent fixture, and Alara, sensing his deep-seated reticence, didn't press. She learned to read his moods from the set of his shoulders, the intensity in his pale eyes, the slight inflections in his muffled voice. One afternoon, while Silas was reinforcing the small corral Tom had built for their single, aging mule, Alara sat on the cabin step, shelling dried beans into a bowl. The baby was active, a series of sharp kicks and fluttering movements reminding her of the precious life she carried. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed, dropping the bowl with a clatter. Silas was by her side in an instant, his hand surprisingly gentle as he steadied her. "Easy there," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You all right?" Just a bit faint," Alara managed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "This little one is making his presence known today." Silas's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at her swollen belly. He retrieved the bowl and began picking up the scattered beans. "You need to rest more, Alara. You're doing too much." "There's so much to do," she sighed, weariness seeping into her voice. "And waiting is the hardest part." He said nothing for a moment, continuing to gather the beans. Then, "I knew a woman once," he began, his voice hesitant, unusually so. "She was strong like you. Faced down a hard winter on her own, with two young ones. She made it through." He paused, and Alara sensed a deep well of unspoken memory behind his words. Resilience comes in many forms. It was the most he'd ever shared about anyone, anything, beyond the immediate necessities of their situation. A small discovery, a tiny crack in the wall of his guardedness. Alara felt a flicker of warmth towards him, a sense of connection that went beyond mere gratitude for his protection. She saw not just a masked enforcer, but a man who had perhaps known loss or witnessed profound strength in others. Their defenses were as good as they could make them. The shutters were secured, the door barred. Silas had found a few of Tom's old traps and set them in less obvious approaches to the cabin, hidden beneath brush. He'd also cleaned and oiled Tom's old shotgun, a relic from his grandfather, checking the dwindling supply of shells. Alara, under his tutelage, even practiced loading it, her hands clumsy at first, but her determination fierce. She would not be helpless. "Aim low if you have to shoot," he instructed, his voice patient. "A leg wound will stop a man just as well as a kill shot, and it's a bigger target." His practicality was grim but necessary. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew cool, Silas returned from a wider scouting patrol looking more somber than usual. He carried a tattered piece of red cloth. "Found this snagged on a greasewood bush, about 2 miles north," he said, holding it out. "Redwind's outfit. One of his men wears a bandana this color." Alara's blood ran cold. 2 miles. They were close. The threat, which had been a looming shadow, now felt immediate, pressing in on them. Are they watching us?" "Could be a scout," Silas said, his eyes narrowed. "Or they could be making camp, planning their move. They know we're here. They know we're waiting." This was the more direct threat, the antagonist's micro-cameo confirming their fears. The rumor of their return was now a certainty. That night, neither of them slept much. Alara lay on her bed, her hand resting on her belly, whispering silent prayers for her child's safety. Silas sat in the lean-to, his back against the cabin wall, his rifle across his knees, a motionless statue in the darkness. The silence of the prairie was heavy, charged with anticipation. A moment of quiet connection had occurred earlier when Alara, noticing a fresh scratch on his hand from setting a trap, had insisted on cleaning it with their dwindling supply of whiskey and a strip of clean linen. He'd allowed her to, his masked face unreadable, but his stillness had spoken of a grudging acceptance of her care. Now, that brief moment of shared humanity felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the chilling certainty of impending violence. The emotional stakes were deepening with every shared glance, every silent vigil. Alara found herself increasingly reliant on Silas, not just for his skill with a rifle, but for his calm presence, his unwavering resolve. She began to fear not just for herself and her baby, but for him too. He was putting himself in incredible danger for her, a woman he barely knew. What compelled such loyalty, such sacrifice? For Silas, the stakes were also shifting. Alara was no longer just a woman in distress he'd felt compelled to help. Her quiet courage, her fierce determination to protect her unborn child, her unwavering resilience in the face of fear, these qualities had etched their way into his guarded heart. The thought of Redwind laying a hand on her, of destroying this small sanctuary she clung to so desperately, filled him with a cold, protective fury. He had spent years running from his past, hiding behind the mask, but here, in this desolate place, with this brave woman, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in a long, long time. The threat of losing this fragile piece, this unexpected connection, was a far greater fear than any outlaw gang. The days blurred into a week, then nearly 2. The constant vigilance was wearing them both down. Supplies dwindled further. Alara grew more uncomfortable as her pregnancy advanced, her movements becoming slower, more labored. Silas's scouting missions became more frequent, his expression more grim. They knew Redwind was out there, biding his time, perhaps trying to unnerve them, or waiting for them to make a mistake. One particularly cold morning, Silas returned with a rabbit, a welcome addition to their meager larder. As Alara skinned and prepared it, Silas watched her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. "Alara," he began, his voice unusually hesitant. "There's a settlement, a small one, called Hope's Creek, about 3 days' ride south. It's off the main trails. Redwin likely doesn't know it. Maybe you should go there. I can see you safely to its outskirts." Alara stopped her work, her hands still. Go? Leave her home? The thought was a painful wrench. But the alternative? "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What would you do?" "I'd lead Redwin on a merry chase," he said, a grim set to his masked jaw. "Keep him occupied until you're safe." She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing past the mask to the man beneath. He was offering to be a decoy, to draw the full fury of the Redwin gang onto himself so she could escape. The enormity of his offer settled heavily in her heart. She thought of Tom, of their dreams for this place. She thought of the child kicking within her, a life that deserved a chance. But she also thought of Silas, this stranger who had become her shield, her unlikely protector. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "This is my home. Tom is buried here. My child will be born here if God wills it. I won't run." She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "We made a pact, Silas. You said you'd stand by me. We faced them together. Here." A long silence followed. Silas studied her, his pale eyes searching hers. Alara saw a flicker of something in their depths. Surprise, respect, perhaps even a reluctant admiration. He had offered her an out, a chance for safety, and she had chosen to stay, to fight. It was a decision that bound them together more tightly than any spoken vow. He finally gave a slow nod. "All right, Alara." Together, then his voice, though still muffled, held a new note of conviction. The decision was made. They would make their stand. The waiting was almost over. The time for fear was past. Now was the time for courage. The stark plains around them seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the storm that was about to break. This was their ground, and they would defend it or die trying. The direct challenge to their bond had been issued not by an outsider, but by Silas's own protective instinct. And Alara's refusal, her resolute choice to stand with him, had forged an even stronger, more unbreakable alliance. The landscape itself seemed to wait, a silent observer to their quiet, desperate pact. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost palpable tension in the days that followed Alara's resolute decision. The distant, circling buzzard Silas had once pointed out seemed to draw nearer, a grim omen hanging in the vast, indifferent sky. They knew Redwin's return was not a matter of if, but when. The waiting gnawed at Alara's nerves, a constant, low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of her forced composure. Silas, too, seemed more on edge, his usual calm stillness replaced by a restless energy. He spent hours on the roof of the soddy, a lonely, masked figure scanning the unending horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. One sweltering afternoon, as Alara rested inside the dim coolness of the cabin, a wave of intense pain gripped her, radiating from her lower back and tightening across her belly. She gasped, clutching herself, her breath catching in her throat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Not now. Please, not now. It was too soon. The baby wasn't due for another few weeks. "Silas!" Her voice was a strangled cry. He was inside in an instant, his dusty boots thudding on the packed earth floor. "Alara? What is it?" His pale eyes, wide with alarm above the mask, took in her contorted face, her clutched stomach. "The baby?" she choked out, another wave of pain making her arch her back. I think it's coming." A flicker of something unreadable crossed Silas's face, shock, helplessness, perhaps even fear. He was a man comfortable with guns and outlaws, with the harsh realities of survival in a dangerous land. But this, a woman in premature labor, alone in a remote cabin with a gang of killers likely closing in, was a different kind of battle, one for which he was utterly unprepared. "All right," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual, but he forced a calmness he clearly didn't feel. "All right, Ilara. Just breathe. Tell me what to do." He helped her to the narrow bed, his movements surprisingly gentle for such a rough-looking man. Ilara, caught in the grip of escalating contractions, could only gasp and cling to his hand, her knuckles white. The world narrowed to the searing pain and the masked face hovering above her. His eyes filled with a desperate concern that touched her deeply. Hours passed in a blur of agony and fear. Silas stayed by her side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, murmuring words of encouragement that were likely as much for himself as for her. He boiled water, though neither of them knew exactly why, only that it was something people did in such situations. He was clumsy, awkward, completely out of his depth, yet his steadfast presence was an anchor in the storm of her pain. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody hues of red and orange. The encroaching darkness brought with it a renewed sense of urgency. Red Wind could arrive at any moment. "Silas," Ilara panted between contractions, her voice weak, you have to watch for them. You can't stay here with me." He shook his head, his grip tightening on her hand. "I'm not leaving you, not now." His voice was fierce, protective. "But Red Wind, damn Red Wind," he growled, his eyes blazing. "He can wait. This is more important." And then, just as another powerful contraction seized her, a new sound cut through the evening air, the unmistakable drumming of multiple horses, approaching fast. Silas's head snapped up, his body instantly tensing. He looked from Ilara, her face pale and beaded with sweat, to the barred door, his expression grim. The outlaws, they had chosen their moment with cruel precision. The high-pressure countdown had begun, not just for the baby's arrival, but for their very survival. "They're here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He released her hand and grabbed his rifle.
"Silas, no."
Ilara cried, fear for him overriding her own pain. "It's too many of them." He turned back to her, and for a moment, his pale eyes seemed to burn through the mask, straight into her soul. "I made a promise, Ilara. I stand by you." He paused. Then, in a voice so low she barely heard it, he said, "My real name, it's Josiah. Josiah Kane." The revelation hung in the air, a stunning, unexpected gift of trust in the face of imminent death. Josiah Kane. The mask was still there, but a piece of the wall around him had crumbled. He was no longer just Silas, the mysterious stranger. He was Josiah, a man with a name, a man who was choosing to lay down his life, if necessary, for her and her child. He moved to the door, checking the bar, then to the small, shuttered window, peering through a crack. "At least 5 of them," he reported, his voice tight. "Red Wind's leading." Ilara cried out as another contraction ripped through her, fiercer than any before. The baby was coming, now with or without their permission, with or without the outlaw's interruption. Josiah, Silas, looked back at her, his face a mask of conflict. His duty was to protect her, but she was in the throes of labor, vulnerable, exposed. Their tactical planning, their meager defenses, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against a determined gang and the undeniable force of nature. "All right, Ilara," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier resolve, though laced with a desperate edge. "We do this. You bring that baby into the world. I'll keep them out, as long as I can." He took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring. He was no midwife and she was no hardened gunfighter, but they had each other. He glanced around the small cabin, his eyes taking in the sparse furnishings, the single bed where Alara writhed in pain, the dim lamplight casting flickering shadows. This was their Alamo. A harsh voice bellowed from outside. "Silas, or whatever your name is, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the woman. Send her out, and we might let you live." It was Redwin, his voice dripping with malice. Josiah ignored him. He moved back to Alara's side, his gaze surprisingly tender. "You're strong, Alara. Stronger than any man I know. You can do this." He squeezed her hand one last time, a silent promise passing between them. Then he turned, resolute, to face the door, his rifle held ready. The showdown was upon them. There would be no more running, no more hiding. Here, in this tiny sod cabin, on the edge of the vast, indifferent prairie, with a new life struggling to be born, Josiah Kane would make his stand. The ramp up to the confrontation was over. The brutal reality was at their door. The cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of the impending violence. Outside, Redwin's voice, amplified by the stillness of the night, was a coarse, insistent intrusion. "Last chance, masked man. We ain't patient." Hoofbeats shuffled restlessly, the jingle of harness a nervous counterpoint to Alara's ragged breathing. Josiah stood like a rock, a dark silhouette against the faintly moonlit cracks in the shuttered window. His rifle was an extension of his arm, his posture one of deadly readiness. Alara, caught in the vice of another contraction, could only watch him, her vision blurring with pain and fear. The small, rough-hewn room, lit by a single flickering lantern, became their entire world, a tiny island of desperate defiance in a sea of hostility. "Stay away from the door, Alara," Josiah commanded, his voice low and steady, though she could hear the tightly coiled tension beneath it. "And keep quiet if you can. Don't let them know." He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. Don't let them know how vulnerable she truly was, how close the baby was to arriving. A volley of loud bangs erupted against the wooden door, making it shudder in its frame. The outlaws were trying to force their way in. "They're testing us," Josiah muttered, more to himself than to her. He didn't fire, conserving his precious ammunition. "Come on out, you coward!" Another voice yelled, younger, angrier. Hiding behind a woman's skirts. Josiah remained silent, his pale eyes scanning the narrow slits in the shutters, waiting. Alara stifled a cry as another wave of pain washed over her. She bit down hard on a strip of leather Josiah had given her earlier, the taste of it coppery and strange in her mouth. She had to be strong. For Josiah. For her baby. Then, a splintering crack sounded from the back of the cabin. One of the shutters over the small window, weaker than the door, was giving way. There at the back, Alara gasped, terror lending her a momentary burst of strength. Josiah whirled, moving with astonishing speed. He fired through the damaged shutter, the roar of his rifle deafening in the confined space. A yelp of pain answered from outside, followed by a string of curses. He'd hit one. "That's one less to worry about," he said grimly, already reloading. But the attack on the back window intensified. Wood splintered, and then the shutter burst inward with a crash, showering the floor with debris. A shadowy figure tried to scramble through the opening. Josiah fired again. The figure jerked and fell back out of sight. But the distraction at the back had given the men at the front an opportunity. The main door groaned under a concerted assault, the bar holding but visibly straining. Redwin's voice, triumphant and cruel, cut through the din, getting tired in there. "Are we? It's only a matter of time." Alara felt an overwhelming urge to push. The baby was coming, truly coming. "Josiah!" she cried out, her voice raw with agony and urgency. "The baby!" Josiah glanced back, his face a stark landscape of conflict in the flickering lamplight. He was caught between two desperate battles, defending their sanctuary and the terrifying, imminent arrival of new life. He saw the sheer agony on Alara's face, the undeniable truth of her words. A section of the door suddenly splintered, a jagged hole appearing near the latch. A hand reached through, fumbling for the bar. Josiah spun, his rifle but smashing down hard on the exposed fingers. A howl of pain and the hand withdrew. But it was a temporary reprieve. They were running out of time. Alara screamed, a long, tearing sound as her body convulsed with the force of birth. At that exact moment, with a final sickening crack, the bar on the door gave way. The door flew open, and Red Wynn himself stood framed in the opening, a wicked grin on his face, his pistol leveled. 2 of his remaining men crowded behind him. Well, Red Wynn sneered, his eyes flicking from Josiah to Alara on the bed, her face contorted in labor. Looks like we arrived just in time for the party. Josiah didn't hesitate. He dived to the side, firing as he moved, forcing Red Wynn and his men to duck back momentarily. The bullet whined past Red Wynn's ear, close enough to make him curse. But Josiah was exposed, away from any cover within the tiny cabin. One of Red Wynn's men, recovering quickly, fired into the cabin. The shot went wide, thudding into the sod wall near Alara's head, showering her with dirt. She screamed again, a sound of pure terror and agonizing effort. It was in that chaotic, desperate moment that Alara, driven by a primal instinct to protect her child and the man fighting for them, remembered Tom's old shotgun. It lay propped in the corner, loaded as Josiah had instructed. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her pain and exhaustion, she reached for it. Her fingers, slick with sweat, closed around the cold stock. It was heavy, unwieldy, but her desperation lent her strength. Red Wynn, seeing Josiah momentarily scrambling for a better position, advanced into the cabin, his grin widening. Nowhere left to run, masked man. Josiah was getting to his feet, bringing his rifle up, but one of Red Wynn's men was quicker, taking aim at him.
No!
Alara shrieked, and then, somehow, she lifted the heavy shotgun, pointed it in the general direction of the doorway, and pulled both triggers. The recoil slammed her back against the wall, the roar of the double-barreled blast filling the small cabin with acrid smoke and thunder. She had no idea if she'd hit anything. Her ears rang, and the cabin was momentarily plunged into a confusing haze. When the smoke cleared slightly, the scene was one of stunned chaos. One of Red Wynn's men lay sprawled in the doorway, clutching his leg, screaming. The other had stumbled back, his face pale with shock. Red Wynn himself, though untouched, was momentarily frozen. His confident smirk wiped away, replaced by disbelief. He hadn't counted on the pregnant woman fighting back. That momentary hesitation was all Josiah needed. He lunged, not with his rifle, but with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He slammed into Red Wynn, the force of the impact sending both men crashing to the floor. Josiah's mask was askew, revealing a glimpse of a hard, grim jawline beneath. His hands were around Red Wynn's throat, his thumbs pressing hard. Red Wynn clawed at Josiah's hands, his eyes bulging, his face turning purple. The remaining outlaw, seeing his leader in mortal danger, tried to intervene, but Josiah, with a guttural roar, twisted and delivered a savage kick that sent the man sprawling. Outside, the wounded outlaw was still screaming. The advantage had decisively, miraculously turned. And then, amidst the grunts and struggles, the ringing in her ears, and the lingering smoke, Alara heard another sound, a thin, reedy wail. Her baby was born. Josiah, hearing it too, seemed to find a renewed strength. With a final, desperate effort, he subdued Red Wynn, wrenching the pistol from his grasp and slamming the outlaw's head against the hard-packed earth floor. Red Wynn went limp. Silence descended, broken only by the baby's cries, Alara's ragged sobs of relief and pain, and the groans of the wounded outlaw outside. Josiah, panting, his chest heaving, slowly got to his feet. He looked at Redwin, then at the other subdued outlaw, then his gaze, full of a fierce, protective light, found Alara. His mask was completely torn now, hanging by a thread, revealing a face that was weathered, scarred, but undeniably human. The triumph was hard-won, paid for in blood, fear, and sheer, unyielding courage. The sacrifice had been their illusion of safety, the last vestiges of Alara's solitude and Josiah's anonymity. The antagonists were not just rebuffed. They were broken, their power shattered by the combined defiance of a pregnant woman and a masked cowboy who had chosen to stand for something more than himself. The decisive turning point had arrived not with a single shot, but with a wave of desperate courage and the cry of a newborn child, signaling not an end, but a new, hard-fought beginning. Their bond, forged in shared peril and solidified in the crucible of battle, was now absolute, an unspoken truth in the quiet, smoke-filled cabin. The immediate aftermath was a strange, suspended moment where the echoes of violence slowly gave way to the insistent, tiny cries of new life. Alara, utterly spent, lay back against the rough wall, her gaze fixed on the small, squirming bundle she now cradled in her arms.
Asson.
He was so small, so perfect, his face red and crumpled, his fists waving feebly. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming exhaustion. Josiah, she thought of him as Josiah now, the mask a tattered remnant of a past self, moved quickly. He disarmed the groaning outlaw in the doorway, then dragged the unconscious Redwin and his other cohort outside, binding them securely with rope from his saddle. The third man, the one Alara had shot in the leg, was moaning pitifully. Josiah, after a cursory check, bound him too, his expression grim but efficient. The threat was neutralized. He returned to the cabin, his movements weary but purposeful. The torn mask hung loosely around his neck. He didn't try to readjust it. He knelt beside Alara, his pale eyes, no longer startlingly anonymous but filled with a profound, raw emotion, fixed on the baby. "A boy?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Alara nodded, managing a weak smile. "A boy." A quiet settled between them, thick with all that had happened, all that had been risked and won. The cabin, though bearing the scars of the fight, the splintered door, the shattered shutter, the lingering scent of gunpowder, felt sacred, a sanctuary consecrated by their shared ordeal. The memory of Redwin's menace, the auction of her dignity that his demands had represented, began to recede, replaced by the fierce, protective love she felt for her son and an overwhelming gratitude for the man kneeling beside her. Josiah reached out a hesitant, calloused finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare and precious sight. "He looks like a fighter," he murmured. "Like his mother." Alara's heart swelled. He saw her strength, her agency. She was no longer just the pregnant woman in peril, but a survivor, a mother who had fought for her child. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky with soft hues of rose and lavender, a lone rider approached the cabin, cautiously. It was old Jedediah Smith, their nearest neighbor, who lived a good 5 miles distant, a reclusive but generally decent man. He'd heard the gunfire in the pre-dawn stillness and had come to investigate, albeit belatedly. He took in the scene the bound outlaws, the battered cabin, Josiah's revealed, weary face, and Alara with a newborn with wide, astonished eyes. "Good Lord Almighty," Jedediah breathed, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Redwin's gang, you too? And a baby?" He shook his head, a slow dawning of respect in his eyes. He offered to ride to redemption for the sheriff, a journey that would take him the better part of the day. It was a small gesture, but it hinted at a shift, a grudging acceptance from the harsh world outside their small haven. Perhaps their courage would earn them a measure of peace. With Jedediah gone, a semblance of normalcy, or at least a new, raw version of it, began to settle. Josiah helped Elara clean herself and the baby as best they could. He was surprisingly gentle, his large hands unexpectedly tender as he handled the tiny infant. He found some clean rags for swaddling, his movements efficient despite his obvious inexperience. The shared task, so intimate and essential, wove new threads into the tapestry of their connection. Later, as Elara rested, the baby sleeping peacefully beside her, Josiah sat by the repaired doorway, cleaning his rifle. The tattered mask lay discarded on the floor. He looked different without it, younger in some ways, older in others. The scars on his face told stories of a hard life, but his eyes, when they met Elara's, held a new softness, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Josiah," she said quietly. He looked up. "Thank you. For everything. For my son." He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the rifle, but a faint flush rose on his weathered cheeks. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The ranch, Tom's dream, battered but still standing, felt like a true home now, their home. The simple act of him cleaning his weapon, a task performed with an easy familiarity, was imbued with a new meaning. He was a guardian, not just a wanderer. He had bought her time, bought her safety, not with money at an auction block, but with courage and a willingness to stand against the odds. And in doing so, he had found something too, something beyond the solitary existence he had clearly known. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm, hopeful light across the plains, Josiah brought Elara a cup of weak broth. She sipped it, her strength slowly returning. He watched her, a quiet intensity in his gaze. He looked at the sleeping child, then back at her. "He'll need a name," Josiah said, his voice a low rumble. Elara smiled. "I was thinking, Thomas, after his father." "Thomas Josiah." A flicker of surprise, then a deep, quiet pleasure softened Josiah's rugged features. He looked away, towards the open doorway and the vast, sunlit prairie beyond, but not before Elara saw the sheen of unshed tears in his pale eyes. He had stood by her, a masked cowboy who had sworn to protect a pregnant woman. He had faced down outlaws, helped deliver her child, and in the process had shed his own disguise, revealing the honorable man beneath. She watched him, this man who was no longer a stranger, this Josiah, and knew that here, in this small sod cabin, amidst the harshness of the frontier, they had found more than just survival. They had found the fragile, resilient beginnings of a new life, a shared future built on a foundation of extraordinary courage and unexpected grace. He had not bought a laborer, nor she a mere protector. In the crucible of shared danger and nascent life, they had found each other's hearts. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.